Welcome, everyone. My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am a senior advisor and editorial director at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I also edit our publication, Responsible Statecraft. We are proud to be hosting today's discussion, War Journalism from Vietnam to Gaza, How War Coverage Impacts U.S. Foreign Policy. If you don't know much about the Quincy Institute, we are an action tank that seeks to reorient failing Washington foreign policy thinking away from militarized solutions to our international problems and towards more diplomatic engagement with the rest of the world. We are part of a growing community of experts, advocates, and writers on both the left and right, pursuing a new path of realism and restraint in a political ecosystem that has for too long succumbed to military intervention as a first rather than last resort. I'd like to thank Thom Shanker for agreeing to moderate today's discussion, which is not only timely, marking the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, the visceral end of the war in Vietnam on April 30th, 1975, but it is critical as the U.S. continues to support major conflicts overseas in Europe and the Middle East today. How the media has covered U.S. wars and how the military and government has endeavored to control and shape that coverage is no mere sideshow in American civic life. It impacts public opinion and drives action for or against more war. I am looking forward to hearing our esteemed panelists put that point into perspective and more this afternoon. So let me formally introduce Mr. Shanker before I hand the mic over to him. Thom was named Director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University in June 2021, after a nearly 25 years stint at the New York Times, including 13 years as Pentagon correspondent, covering the Department of Defense, overseas combat operations, and national security policy. Thom reported the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan on the ground in both countries, embedding in the field with American military units throughout his time there. Most recently, he had served as deputy Washington editor for the Times, managing coverage of the military, diplomacy, and veterans affairs. He is also co-author of Counterstrike, the untold story of America's secret campaign against al-Qaeda, published in August 2011. And the book became a New York Times bestseller. So thank you again, Thom, and I hand it over to you for what promises to be a wonderful discussion.
Kelly, thank you so very much for that kind introduction. And, needless to say, the work of the Quincy Institute is just absolutely invaluable to contributing to an informed citizenry. And I know this conversation today will be just like that. Just for those who are joining us, thank you for being here. We will have a moderated discussion for the first 30, 35 minutes, and then we will move into Q&A. I'll try to get to as many as possible. You'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please drop your questions in there, and the Quincy staff will help me curate them, and we will get to as many as we can. As Kelly said, this panel will explore combat coverage, the changing nature of war, especially journalism, since Vietnam to today, and what it means for the conduct of war and war policy, and more importantly, for the termination of wars fought or backed by the United States. We're lucky to have two absolute experts, experienced, articulate. I know you'll enjoy hearing from both of them. Arnold Skip Isaacs is a former reporter, foreign and Washington correspondent, and editor of the Baltimore Sun. He covered the last 3 years of the Vietnam War on the ground and is the author of Without Honor, Defeat in Vietnam, and Cambodia and Vietnam Shadows, The War, Its Ghosts, and Its Legacy. He's now a freelance writer and educator, has taught at universities in China, Ukraine, and has conducted training programs for journalists and journalism students in more than a dozen countries in the former Soviet Union, Central and Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So clearly Skip is still giving back to our profession. Our second guest is Azmat Khan. She is the Birch Assistant Professor of She is the Birch Assistant Professor at Columbia Journalism School, where she also leads the Lee Center for Global Journalism. She has another hat as investigative reporter for both the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine. Notably, she anchored the New York Times team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2022 for amazing coverage of civilian casualties caused by the U.S. military and overseas operations. That project, of course, caught very well-deserved global attention, and rightly so. And I wanted to point out that even from the Pentagon podium, the value of that reporting was acknowledged. The DoD spokesman at the time, Rear Admiral John Kirby, you may know that he went on to be Biden's national security spokesman, said this from the podium after the Pulitzer was announced. Quote, "The Times coverage was, and it still is, not comfortable, not easy, and not simple to address. We know we have more work to do to prevent civilian harm. We knew that we had made mistakes. We're trying to learn. I cannot say this process was pleasant, but that's what a free press at its very best does. It holds us to account and makes us think even as it informs. It changes our minds, and it helps us be better at our big job of defending this nation." So Skip, Azmat, thank you for being here. Thanks for all of your work. And I think Admiral Kirby has set us up very, very well for the important themes of our discussion. As Kelly said, April 30th, 1975, 50 years ago this month, the fall of Saigon. It's fair to say that Vietnam is a case of how a war gone bad and coverage of that war going bad deeply influenced public opinion and government policy. Skip, you were on the ground. Describe for us, if you would, how you saw that arc of narrative and what was the principal factor that eroded public support, and how did that happen?
Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that it was a different era. It was a very different war, and journalism was completely different than it is now. So comparisons, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't think about and remember it together with wars in Gaza and other American wars since then. But the comparisons are very complex. They're not simple. I think that the first thing to remember about Vietnam, this is not so much remembering my time on the ground, but a more general comment, if that's okay.
Of course.
Is to consider that the war in Vietnam was reported from two theaters of war, not one. On the ground in Vietnam, where the shooting war was going on, and the debate at home, where over 5 or 6 years there was a constant stream of news on the American debate on the war, on anti-war demonstrations, on draft resistance, gradually increasing political and congressional action, on considering the war policy and that kind of thing. And the memories of that reporting have kind of merged in our national memory with our memories of the reporting on the shooting war. And so nothing comparable happened in any other U.S. war certainly not in the post-Vietnam era. So we need to be careful and not facile in drawing comparisons. So it happens that I covered both these theaters of war in Washington. I was based in Washington from 69, 70, and 71. And the first half of 72, and I attended most of the major demonstrations during those years and wrote lots of stories focusing on the national debate on Vietnam in Congress and in political campaigns in various states and around the country. And then in June 72, as the American war was really winding down, or had wound down, I was assigned to Vietnam, and I reported from there full-time for the next year plus. Made several more trips in the next year or so, and then I was there in the spring of 75 for the final 3 months of the war, first in Cambodia and then in Vietnam until the U.S. evacuation on the 29th, the day before the end of the war. So my sense is that I think that the impact, the reporting that had the more impact on opinion was probably more, well, it came from both places, I guess. But I wrote this about at some point, and I think the concept of war that reporters brought with them to Vietnam or to the discussion in the United States was based primarily on World War II. And that and I wrote somewhere that Americans are taught to think of war as a narrative, something that begins, proceeds through a succession of battles, and then comes to an end. And the battles in Vietnam seemed random episodes of violence, not connected in any logical way. When the fighting ended somewhere, one could see the bodies in the smashed villages, but almost never any change in the war, any indication that one side was closer to winning or losing. The battles I wrote were like grenades thrown in a stream. After the splash subsided and the noise died away and the dead fish floated downstream, the stream looked exactly as it did before, running between the same banks with the same force and the same appearance that it always had. And I think that was characteristic of the way the war was reported. People couldn't tell what it, and in the end, those battles were irrelevant. That was not what decided the course of the war. And I think that the change in opinion responded more to the events than to the coverage. The events themselves, people forget that this war went on, the American involvement in Vietnam went on for twice as long as the whole period of engagement in World War II, 6-7 years. American forces were fighting in Vietnam. During that time, the American reporters paid very little attention to the Vietnamese War. And in the end, that was the war that was just decided how it would all turn out. So that's, I guess, my first thoughts on this subject.
I'd like to drill into a couple of things you said. You actually anticipated my next two questions for you, so you're making my job very easy. Thank you. But there is one, Skip, in our preparation, you had some very thoughtful comments about the interplay, and I don't like the chicken and egg phrase, but it's like the war was going badly. The reporting on the war reflected that it was going badly and in ways that it hadn't before. But did that really influence what was going on inside the Department of Defense and in the White House? And if so, at what levels, who affected whom the most? What were the deciding factors?
Well, I'm not sure what period you're talking about. And I think most of the time it wasn't so much that the war was going badly, but it was just that we weren't winning. We weren't making any headway. We were fighting the same battles over and over again, and nothing seemed to change. And the official policy or word message for the first 3 years or so was that, oh, we're making progress, we're winning, and by and large the public accepted that. And then and in November 1967, General Westmoreland, the commander of the Vietnam, came back to the States and gave a speech at the National Press Club in which he said, we're winning, the enemy is certainly losing, he said. And less than 3 months later, the Tet Offensive, that some of you will remember, came about, and it kind of exploded that optimism and destroyed the credibility of these optimistic statements. The people in the Pentagon, the people in the Defense Department and in the White House, they knew they could tell what was happening. They didn't need the reporters to tell them what was going on in Vietnam or to show them that the optimism had been misplaced. And a lot of people in the administration had already had serious doubts about the wisdom and effectiveness of the policy. And they were encouraged to speak out about those doubts, but I think were much more affected by the events themselves than by the press coverage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Azmat, I'd like to move to the more current wars. Well, 20 plus years current, I guess. The forever wars after 9/11. Your powerful work is focused so much on airstrikes and civilian casualties, both by remotely piloted craft called drones, as well as the legacy air platforms, the good old-fashioned fighters and bombers. And I know you've made the point before that this strike from the sky allowed the U.S. to carry out operations with fewer troops on the ground, fewer body bags coming home. So talk about, if you would, your important reporting and how these narratives also influence public opinion and government decision-making.
Thank you so much, Thom, and it's an honor to be here with you, Skip. My work primarily focuses on these sort of drawdown years, until present, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And I continue to do reporting today related to Gaza and the West Bank and what we're seeing in the Middle East. But the shift that you're talking about is one in which, after the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which were deeply unpopular with the American public over time, particularly as American troops were dying in these wars, we saw a shift in approach to those wars, whereby, particularly under Obama, we began to see bringing troops home and substituting essentially support of foreign forces on the ground, allied forces, through the use of airstrikes. And that air campaign did a number of things. These different air campaigns did a number of these things. In particular, though, I think they took away many of the political costs for Americans of these wars. So what you would have is, for example, in Operation Inherent Resolve, the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, more Americans died by suicide, more American service members died by suicide than in hostile death in that operation. And what that means is that you have fewer American soldiers dying than would ordinarily happen in our wars on the ground previously, which is a good thing. But it also meant that traditional restraints, things that would wake up the American population, which was what was happening, for example, during the Vietnam War. Traditional restraints like Americans coming home in body bags, an awareness of what we're paying for and what we're doing was further and further distanced from populations. And you could essentially have these wars that would continue with very little oversight. And you can see, these trends that emerge that, for example, it was October of 2017 when 4 US service members were killed in an ambush in Niger, that suddenly Congress was asking, what are American service members doing in Niger? There was very little accountability or oversight before that. But when American soldiers were killed, it was a very different story. In August of 2021, when 13 US service members were killed in an attack at Abbey Gate at the Kabul airport in Afghanistan during the drawdown, I saw a huge shift in news coverage. And suddenly news organizations, podcasts, people that wouldn't normally contact me for interviews wanted to talk about Afghanistan. There were also, more than 100 Afghan civilians who were killed in that operation. But what we've seen in sort of the public's attention in terms of restraint, accountability, even awareness that these wars are taking place are often as a result of Americans being killed. I would say that, today we've seen actually one difference, which is that the American public has been forced to be very aware of the war in Gaza. In large part, even though we're not, personally paying the costs, there are Americans who've been killed in Gaza. There are Americans, who, people with dual citizenship and others who've been killed. But that's not the reason why the world is sort of forced to confront with that coverage. I would say in this case, it's a strong movement. I sometimes will scroll TikTok and I'll see kids, young people, Gen Z, people explaining what a Hellfire missile does, telling you about what a 2,000-pound bomb can do. And in the previous years, I was not seeing this. There was very little mainstream awareness or attention on how our wars are playing out, the weapons being used. And the difference, I would say, is that, activists, pushing for Palestinian liberation have really been strong in educating the world and informing the world and introducing some of these realities. But I would say more than that, I think a lot of Palestinian journalists, which, we can talk about, at length, I'm sure, but a lot of Palestinian journalists, this is a very small enclave in Gaza. And journalism is, a career there, the way that when you ask young people here, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you hear people talk about wanting to be a firefighter or a teacher. Journalism is a response you would get in Gaza if you were talking to young people about what they wanted to be. There is such a cultural commitment to documentation the values of journalism are deeply espoused in culture there, a desire to record, a desire to bear witness. And there are so many journalists in Gaza who have genuinely been trained as journalists and have genuinely spent incredible time documenting the realities of war as it unfolds around them. You can really see Palestinian journalists who are paying these costs firsthand, whose family members who've been killed, many of their colleagues and loved ones who've been killed, and they continue to report despite some of the most extreme circumstances I've seen for journalists. And I would say that one of the reasons why the public is informed about ground realities, given the lack of access for foreign journalists to go into Gaza unembedded, is undeniably Palestinian journalists who are paying really incredible costs with their lives.
Thank you for that. And thank you for mentioning social media. We'll get to that next. But I did want to follow up on one thing you said, which is the access question. In the forever war since 9/11, there's been unilateral reporting, reporters on the ground. There's been embedded reporting in the largest numbers since World War II, probably. And then there's been long-term investigative work like what you did, Azmat. Talk a little bit about sort of the differences, the values, and I don't want to say professional risks as in danger, but the downsides.
This is a great question. We were just talking about it in my course at Columbia Journalism last night, just about the range of different kinds of embedded or non-embedded, unembedded reporting that can take place, and the different ways in which, these can be dangerous, especially when reporting is conducted in a silo. And looking at, they're incredible reporters who, as the war in Afghanistan, for example, increasingly became doomed, and as people were more aware of it, to understand that you would largely, to spot it in real time, you would really have to be following a lot of these unembedded journalists. There are so many journalists, from Anand Gopal to others who were unembedded on the ground and reflecting realities you would not have seen from embedded coverage. And that was where you would actually get that early understanding that would only become, understood in the mainstream later, that this war was, America was not winning this war, that American officials, even later, that we would learn in the Afghanistan papers and elsewhere, that they knew they were not winning this war and that their prospects for winning it were dim. But to know that, you would have had to have been unembedded. There's a really great report I always reference from that era, I think by Jeremy Starkey in the Times of London, where he'd received a Pentagon press release about, apparently some Taliban members who'd been killed after they had, by Americans after an honor killing of women. And he essentially journeys to this site. And what he learns is that these are actually US backed, one of them had been a US allied police force, that these were not Taliban members, and that actually American soldiers had killed the women and then essentially tried to dig the bullets out of these women's bodies in order to cover it up. And had he relied on that press release, or had he relied on an embed, this would not have been a story you would have been exposed to. And there are countless examples of that. There are cases in which embedded journalism can tell you an important story that is, a specific story about the experiences of American soldiers. People often refer to Restrepo as an example, a film that really documents, I think a platoon in Afghanistan in real time and tells the story of what they endured as they were doing what they were doing. And if you're trying to tell a specific story like that, it might make sense. I would say, there are so many powerful examples of embeds in which, and I'll give an example of Ali Arkady, who was an Iraqi photojournalist who during the war against ISIS embedded with emergency Iraqi forces. And he was with them for a while and photographing, and what he documented was some of the most extreme torture. Examples in which people were bound and tortured. And had he not done that embed, the public would not have known the extent to which torture was taking place by US allied forces. Chris Hondros, who during the war in Iraq in 2005, during an embed at a US checkpoint in Iraq, in Tel Afar, Iraq, took the first images of this family who were killed at a checkpoint. He quickly left and uploaded those photos in real time. He left he managed to get those photos out, and it changed the world's perception of that war. These iconic images of a bloodied girl whose family has just been killed woke the world up to checkpoint killings, which were happening frequently. I think in this current moment, in the war in Gaza, there's a huge access problem, and that is that foreign journalists are not allowed to enter Gaza unembedded. Both Israel and Egypt have denied them access to doing so. That means that from a lot of our American publications coverage that they're doing themselves with Western correspondents is coming either from embeds with the Israeli forces, which do have rules. Often there are censorship requirements, there is photo approval requirements, there are, different restrictions that come with an embed. And if you look at, for example, major news organizations that went to Al-Shifa hospital on embeds, after the Israelis had raided Al-Shifa, you would get a very particular, and you can look at these stories, you will get a very particular and narrow understanding of what happened at Al-Shifa than if you had interviewed doctors, civilians, survivors, or turned to Palestinian journalists, some of whom were present in Al-Shifa and documenting the realities there. And I think that's where this lack of access has had extremely dangerous consequences for the information environment, for our understandings of the war, and especially for accountability journalism that exposes wrongdoing. I think that news organizations have raised concerns about their lack of access, but at the same time, they have not fought this fully to the capacity that they can. I do know about some court cases where they are challenging this. In Israel, they're challenging this access. But in terms of the ability to really shape that and to also take other measures, I personally have a rule, for example, that I follow, which is that I will not go on an embed to a place unless I can also go unembedded. So, for example, during the wars, against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, I did do an embed at the U.S. Air Base in Qatar, and it was extremely fruitful for understanding the targeting process. But I was willing to do it because I could also go on the ground, and it was accountability journalism for me. So my rule is that I won't do one if I can't do the other. And yet, we're in an information operating environment where mainstream press often is, even if they're being transparent about the restrictions they may be placed under, they're not necessarily doing their due diligence to show you what they are not getting when they're going on these sort of curated tours. In many respects, obviously there are exceptions to that. But if you look at a lot of embedded journalism, this has had a dramatic effect. And I do think that there are consequences in terms of US foreign policy. There are consequences in terms of our understanding of what's happening in real time. And one of the things that I think is really dangerous about this, because sometimes you might just think, well, when we're allowed access, when it's safe to go, we're going to go and we're going to do this reporting and we'll do it safely. A lot of evidence is being wiped out. Both, physically, bulldozers are going through places and destroying evidence. In very recent examples, for example, the killings of medics in Gaza, you actually have, this unraveling story that the Israeli government has provided about what happened and how these ambulances and paramedics were killed, many of them shot in the head, some of them with their hands tied behind their backs and buried, and their ambulances bulldozed. And when a video finally materializes by one of those paramedics showing, what he saw in the moments before he was shot and killed, that contradicts the Israelis' narrative, that these ambulances had not been running their headlights, that they had not, that they were advancing suspiciously. When there is that direct confrontation, you start to see this unravel. And you also hear the Israelis now saying, well, they were buried because we wanted to make sure that dogs didn't eat their bodies. That's why we buried the ambulances on those bodies. And when you see that fall apart, I think it's a really strong example of how many stories did we not hear because there was not a phone that managed to survive being buried and bulldozed. And I think that every journalist who goes on an embed needs to ask themselves those questions about what they're doing when they're choosing to undertake that embed, what they're missing, and whether they're really trying hard enough to understand what they're not getting.
Thank you. You actually anticipated some of the questions from the audience, which is about access issues. But before we go to lots of those, I do want to drill a little bit deeper into the social media issue, because clearly from the time Skip was in Vietnam to today, the technology for filing your stories from a conflict zone has changed immensely. And today it's almost as if in whether Ukraine, Gaza, Iraq, Syria, anywhere, every citizen is a reporter because they have their iPhone camera and video. So since the theme of today is the impact on policy, how has this incredible increase in, availability of images from conflict zones that were never available before, how does it affect policy? Skip, I'd like to start with you on that.
Well, I don't know that I can answer that. I'm not a user of most of this modern technology, and of course, in Vietnam there wasn't even any internet. We sent our stories back by telex, which is a technology that I imagine a lot of people listening to this don't even know what it is. And photographs were, until very late in the war, there was no way to transmit photographs right away, or television film. It was shipped by air to Tokyo or Bangkok, and then broadcast to the home. So most of the television shots that you saw were 24, 36, 48 hours after they were actually taken. If I can go back to a somewhat different point.
Sure.
No, okay, never mind. I'll leave it. I'll leave it at that. I
Okay.
have something else I want to say, but I'll save it for later.
Yeah, but even though you said that you weren't on point, you actually were, because the delay in getting out those news stories and the film and video actually slowed down the need of the government to respond quickly and immediately. I mean, as Azmat said, well, the impact in Ukraine and Gaza is visible to us every day.
Yes, and if I can add, I just want to share a kind of exception to some of this, which is Afghanistan, where there's very little internet penetration in areas where this war was most fought, these battlefield provinces, the areas of these very rural areas where there's not even just no internet largely. There was also very few phone lines in most of these places. And when I would be investigating incidents there was sometimes I would receive videos from sources on the ground, but the likelihood of my ever, going online and being able to find those videos surfacing somewhere was extremely low. It was very direct to contact. And I think that had a profound and sad and tragic impact on coverage of the war, especially as fewer journalists were going to those areas. And to be clear, they were deadly places to go during the war. These are places where I remember I would often ask people to meet me in Kandahar city, from Helmand, from dangerous parts of Kandahar, because my going there felt like certain death. I wouldn't be allowed to. So I just want to paint that juxtaposition for a second. And I also want to talk about Ukraine and Gaza and the imagery and videos that we saw come out in real time. And with Gaza, I want to say specifically that if you are watching, there are really two kinds. I'm seeing a bifurcation in the news environment where there are, especially young people, that are watching a lot of that imagery unfold in real time. They're watching lives. I remember a journalist in particular. There are many journalists that they follow, but one in particular was Motaz Aziza, who would essentially run to the sites of these airstrikes, running his Instagram account live. And there is undeniable, the footage that they saw, literally the bodies hanging from trees as he approached, people being pulled out. It was not constructed. It was not fake. It was not, some scene that had been set up. He was running live, and people were seeing for the first time what the impact US weapons were having on the ground, and they were profoundly moved by that. And the interesting thing to me is that young people can tell you these very iconic images of this war, of the girl who cried as she said she knew that the body behind her was her mother's because she recognized it by her hair. You know, the boy who walked through floodwaters with his sibling in his arms. You know, there are countless examples. The boy with the eyeball. I won't say more than that. If you know it, you know it. There are these iconic images that have been rendered into artwork, you know, where like a beheaded child will have a flower coming out of his head. Like they're iconic. People know what you're referencing when you see this, but only if you've been watching. And then I've sometimes had conversations, and I want to be careful about what I say because some of these conversations were not on the record, with editors where I've asked them, do you know about, sometimes I'll ask them about specific hostages who were killed, and they would recognize them. I'd be like, do you know the girl on the motorcycle who was kidnapped by Hamas? And they're like, yes, that's Noah Argamini. I will ask them then, like, do you know the girl who recognized her mother by her hair? And they're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And I think that distinction, it's not just editors, it's the public. As a mainstream, there are two different groups now. There's young people who are following this, and there are other people who get their news primarily from news outlets that sometimes sanitize it, but are also slower to show it. You will see, for example, in the days after the paramedic attacks, the ambulance attacks that I just talked about, that very quickly surfaced in Palestinian media, and that the Red Crescent and others were talking about this in real time. And it took a while for it to materialize in a lot of papers, and particularly with the level of detail that had been documented by others. There is a lag, and then there's also often extreme differences in what is told and how it is told. And one of the things impacts that is having is that it is creating a great deal of distrust among those people who are watching live in a lot of mainstream news organizations. And that distrust, I think, will be an enduring legacy for every major US paper, every legacy news organization, and something that I think there's a reckoning that will be coming with respect to.
Thanks. I have a dozen more questions. I do want to get to the audience, but Skip, I also want to be respectful. You said that you had a related thought that you wanted to share. Please.
Well, I was going to say that the other thing is, speaking now about American reporters covering the war that I attended in Vietnam, it was a question of what they went and looked for. In those days, you weren't going to go someplace and find videotape of the effects of war. And there was very little attention paid to the Vietnamese experience of the war. But when I got there in June 1972, as I say, the American war was just about wound down, and then the next 6 months later, there was the ceasefire that resulted in the complete withdrawal of American ground forces. So the reporters were, for the first time, going in the field with Vietnamese troops. But still, the notion that we had that reporting war meant reporting on battles, on soldiers on the ground, and that was the meaningful reporting, and it was not the experience of the people who lived through it. And one of my colleagues, who was also my brother-in-law, is a reporter named David K. Shipler of the New York Times. And Dave has just published a book. It came out, I don't know, a week or so ago, called The Interpreter. And it's a novel, but it's based on his real experience. And if you read it, you would read things that you would almost never have read during the war about the experience of Vietnamese villagers on all kinds of circumstances, not just atrocities, but the impact that the war had on their lives. And it reminds you of how little that was recognized or appreciated. And when reporters did report on it, it didn't get much play in the U.S. A friend of mine, or not a friend, but an acquaintance of mine named Martin Stewart Fox, who was an Australian who worked for UPI and then later became a scholar, mostly specializing on Laos. But Stewart Fox wrote one place that the news agencies and others did report on South Vietnamese politics, for example, and even military activity, but not a lot was printed. In the U.S., there was simply no interest in the Vietnamese side of the war. From the time that U.S. Marines landed in Da Nang, Vietnam was portrayed as an American war to win or lose. And yet, at the end, it turned out that the Vietnamese war was the one that determined the outcome and the future of Vietnam. And it was very, very badly covered, very, very intermittently and sketchily covered.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks. In fact, one of the questions in the queue goes the same thing about in Iraq and Afghanistan. So my last question, I ask this every time I talk to journalists, because there are some student journalists and working journalists now. And because we're timed at the end of the war in Vietnam, Tim O'Brien wrote a fantastic book of linked short stories from Vietnam called The Things They Carried.
Yes.
And my question is not what do you carry as far as books and granola bars and meaningful things, but what do you think reporters need to carry into conflict in their heart and in their soul? Because we've all spent time in combat. A certain kind of bravery is important, yes, but I'd say also curiosity, empathy, the need to be an aerobic listener so you can give voice to those who cannot speak, and to try to put a little bit of justice back in the world. But when the two of you go out and risk your lives to cover these stories, what do you carry in your heart and in your head? Azmat, we'll start with you.
That's such a beautiful question. A genuine willingness to listen and to learn, a desire to understand, particularly from traumatized populations, but not to do so at the expense of their health or their sanity. I spent a lot of time interviewing survivors of war who it always perplexes me when they agree to talk to me, because doing so inevitably means opening up a chapter of their life that is the worst experience for them to ever think about again. And they do it in the hopes that their voices will make a difference. And so there's a deep sort of respect and gratitude for that. I carry that with me. I also, that contract, I guess, you have is also then to also do all of the other reporting that I need to do. That means with the US government or with other governments who are involved, meaning like I will fight for that embed so that I can understand the process behind it, but also so that nobody can just cast off this story and say, she didn't even look at this targeting process. Same with, my efforts to get information through the government using the Freedom of Information Act and lawsuits, that I will really bring that rigor to every part of whatever story I'm doing. And then I hope a humility too, that I have a lot to learn from anyone and everyone. And that the way I was raised and intellectual curiosity are at the forefront of whatever it is that I do. And lastly, truth, whatever the consequences might be. And I think journalists are sort of seeing that sort of play out for them in ways we haven't seen before in this era.
Thank you. Skip answered Tim O'Brien's question. What are the things that you carried?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think maybe what I think about now is that we ought to be clear about what war is. That war is that what we're covering is not just a series of battles, but it's an event that happens to people, and that's that should never be out of our mind. Not all our stories would chronicle that in the same way. Official announcements and communiques and press releases and all that are also part of the news. I mean, we have no way to report on, say, casualties that we can't count them ourselves. We have to depend on somebody else's count. But I think that, and it's a little hard to recapture, what I thought at the time. I guess I just thought my job was to go out and find something that was important and not lose sight of what the setting, the context of what I was reporting, and try to make that clear when in my reporting.
Great. Thank you so much. First question that really caught my eye is from Doug. And Doug says, I was drafted and served as a combat correspondent for the U.S. Army in Vietnam, 1970 and 71. I had great faith in the Fourth Estate, witnessed the Pentagon Papers, and later Watergate. But with an all-volunteer military and corporate journalism, the public is personally disconnected from America's wars and has no viable source of truth in war reporting. How do we turn this around? Reintroduce a draft? Restrict corporate ownership somehow? Panelists.
I will answer that, or I could, in a point that I raised with you a while ago, or before this program, that the journalists who went to Vietnam were products of the post-World War II or World War II era and the draft era. Most of them, I think, the majority probably of the male correspondents had been in the service. I wasn't, but it was much closer. There was a much less of a gap between civilian life and the military life. And now I think it's a huge gap. Soldiers, the soldier's life is completely separate from the life that most journalists have lived. And I think that we lived in the same world to some extent. Getting drafted for Vietnam was not the same thing. It was very different from getting drafted into the peacetime army, but it gave you some common basis of experience. So not sure that answers your question, but I think but that's what occurs to me to say.
Mm-hmm. Azmat?
Oh, I can't comment on whether or not the US should bring back the draft. But I do think a lot about how asymmetry and who's paying the costs of war dramatically impact coverage. And I had I had a view for a while, I think until I would say October 7th, that the only way the public would really pay attention or follow wars was when there was like close loss of life for Americans when they felt that. And I think we've seen the war in Gaza challenge that. I think we've seen the public, again, I can't really emphasize how interesting it has been to see like young people in particular be extremely informed about US weaponry in a way that they were not previously, and what that can be attributed to, which is those Gazan journalists on the ground and sort of that desire to document and some of the larger movement trends that you can see. So I don't know. I don't have a prescriptive answer, but I really appreciate your sharing that story. It was powerful.
Thanks. Next question comes from Siddharth. It's one close to me. It goes to the power of narrative, because as we've said several times here, there are facts, but they have to be into a narrative. And Siddharth asked both of you, can the wounds of war be at least partially healed through storytelling? What has your experience been when it comes to war reportage in terms of this dimension? What are your thoughts?
In terms of?
The wounds of war, in other words, just telling the story and reporting the story, Skip, is that a way to help heal the psychological wounds of war, or even the wounds to a nation?
I think storytelling plays a profound role in our understanding of wars, and that oftentimes that great storytelling reaches people in a way that, I often have to publish in different forms. So I'll do like a newspaper investigation that is very hard hitting and way too many facts, but it's an investigation and it's accountability reporting, and it's not a pleasant read, right? And then I'll do, a magazine story, or I'll do, an episode on the daily where storytelling is the means through which we approach those, and really in ways that really make people want to listen. And you may not get every single fact in, but there's a beautifully crafted narrative. And I've seen those types of stories reach people in a way that much deeper, harder investigative reporting never could. And I do think that there is, a real need for translation of these events that go beyond a mere chronicling of facts, but a narrative that brings people in and allows them to feel and understand emotions that render the lives of the people we cover meaningful. That portrays what they see and hear, and that's a responsibility we have. Honestly, I hate writing. I hate it so much. It's my least favorite thing in the world. I love writing, but I know that I have to tell good stories in order to reach people. And I think reach people is the first part of what you're talking about, which is like healing from the wounds of war, which, you know, I don't have prescriptive answers on, but I do think, you know, reaching people in that way and bringing those emotions and that clarity really depends on great storytelling and of fairness and accuracy.
Thanks. Here's one from Amir that I know you both can answer. He, of course, says, thanks to you both for sharing your perspectives. In looking at war from Vietnam to Gaza, it's terrible and heartbreaking. Yes, that's the definition of war. But if you're passionate about the topic, which both of you are, does it ever become challenging to remain independent, neutral in your professional work? Skip, was it ever hard for you in Vietnam to like not?
No. And I want to go back to the previous question first,
please.
if I may.
Of course.
That when people go through traumatic experience, almost everybody, I think, you have a need to try to make sense of it. You have to need to sort of explain why this happened to you and what happened to you and why it happened. And so you could construct a narrative, but that narrative doesn't have to be a true narrative. Lots of people explain things to themselves in a false narrative. And I think that journalism, I mean, I felt that my job was to try to tell the truth as far as I could, and recognizing the limitations that journalism had. But that I'm not sure many people don't want to believe that truth that I found, and find comfort in a truth, a different truth that they believe. So I'm not sure that the journalism is an answer to that. It is to those people who are receptive to the facts that you report. I usually talk about facts, not truth, because truth is sort of a big word. But a lot of people aren't receptive to it, and if they can find healing in themselves, I thought Vietnam was a terrible waste of life. But if I were a parent who had lost my kid in Vietnam and I wanted to explain it to myself as dying in a just cause, I'm not going to go and tell that parent that they're wrong. That's not my job. Right. My job is to tell the truth to anybody who wants to listen. And sorry, what was your second question?
Yeah, the second question is how hard. War is ugly, it's brutal, it's vile. You obviously have feelings about it. How hard is it to be passionate in your reporting, but not let that passion influence the reporting and writing?
I didn't find it hard. I mean, I guess, I don't know, maybe maybe that's a reflection on my character, but it was fairly simple, to me, to try to figure out what were the facts and what I could say and what I could write that would be truthful or be accurate, and what I could write that wouldn't be accurate, and to make sure. And this is when I teach journalism, I always teach journalists that the first thing you have to understand is to know what you don't know. And I think most journalists who make mistakes because they don't know what they don't know. Mm-hmm. And I always tried to be aware of that. Mm-hmm. And that's not always that easy. But I guess I never did trust ideology. And I never did trust anybody with an ideology, whether I approved it or not. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way to find reality. Thanks. And so I never interpreted what I was seeing in any kind of ideological way.
Azmat?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm an investigative journalist specifically, is that it is systematic and it is, a type of inquiry. So it's not like, I start a story with, I believe this thing and let me go see. It's, here's something, here's a question, I want to test it. Can I do a sample? What is every argument that could be made against this? Let me understand where I might be. These findings might not match up, but I really appreciate that inquiry. It is true that investigative journalists, what they focus on is injustice or harm. And, they have to meet a certain threshold in order for that to become an investigation. And I think that's there. And I will say that, of course, you will have feelings, and it's how you channel them. I am moved by a lot of, I mean, you can probably listen to the Daily and hear me cry, as I talk about survivors I've interviewed and spent time with. Clearly it does affect me, but I see that emotion is, a part of processing what it is that I'm doing. It is not a driver of the approach that I take or the standards that I have to meet or the systematic nature of investigative journalism. There's a reason why, I sued for thousands of pages of military records and spent years analyzing them and going on the ground and spent years and years doing that work before I published, right? Like there is a threshold you have to meet. And I think I always urge myself, like, I don't get angry at myself for being, emotional or having feelings, in my own presence. But how am I using that wisely? And am I meeting the thresholds and standards that every investigative journalist should?
Thank you. Quincy will probably never ask me back again because I'm going to take us a minute or two over. We also started late because the last question is from, let's say, a ringer. Anthony Borden, who's the founder of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, knows so much about this, asks a fantastic question, which will be our last one today. Could the panel compare the evolving impact of disinformation in conflict? Is propaganda the same as ever, or is it evolving? Is there a specific aspect of active measures, hybrid warfare, aiming at deeper impacts and more strategic influence over your reporting and therefore over shaping policy?
I will say that, yes, we can see efforts to thwart journalism through disinformation. I mean, propaganda has always been a part of any part of war, but I think in recent years, I think we're seeing, a number of organizations and movements that are approaching it in a more systematic manner than I've ever seen. You can see it in watchdogs or so-called watchdogs that police reporting out of interest for a particular state or a people. You can see it in efforts to dox and you can see it, even journalists are now being put on canary mission. Journalists who are merely covering the protests, student journalists who are merely covering the protests here at Columbia. You can see it at, a site that weaponizes, accusations. And there are really just, I think, disinformation that's coming in the form of, overt AI videos and other kinds of means of manipulation. Certainly, social media plays a role, but it is not relegated only to those sorts of fields. It is also in very sophisticated very sophisticated operators, who will go through kind of extreme measures, I think, to influence newsrooms. So it can take place. Propaganda is always a part of war, and there are people on multiple sides fighting it. And it's our jobs as journalists to stick to the truth and to try to see through it everywhere we can, wherever it's coming from.
Skip, as someone who's devoted so many decades to work going back to Vietnam, I will give you the last word. Anything on your mind you'd like to say?
Well, I think that, yes, I think there's a huge difference now. And the difference to me is that there's such a volume of stuff and available instantly while you're sitting at your home in front of your computer or your phone, I guess. Anybody who wants to believe anything can go online and in 10 minutes find 50 sources that support that belief. That didn't used to be the case. I mean, in my time, when I was at the years I was in Vietnam, there was the mainstream media was really the only source of news. There was hardly, there were sort of underground newspapers, but there was negligible. So people who didn't want to believe what we reported didn't have the support of hundreds. I mean, they had word of mouth, but they didn't have support from any other sources for the erroneous things that they preferred to believe that we reported were not true. I think truth has a much more difficult to get through now than it was then.
Thank you. So just to wrap up, and we're only a minute over, I don't feel so bad. Skip, Azmat, thank you for sharing your insight and wisdom. Thank you to all who are tuning in, to those who ask such great questions, and a special thanks to the Quincy Institute. What you do to help elevate and inform citizenry is so valuable. Thank you all.